Thank you, Jay. Last but not least, if I can turn to Areg Kochinyan, who is president of the Research Center on Security Policy here in Armenia. You've heard now from both Americans and Europeans on where they see the relationship headed, some of the implications they think, the spillover possible effects it might have for this part of the world. How do you see it sitting here in Yerevan?
Thank you. I think that Armenia and the European Union found themselves in quite the same position at different periods of time, meaning that both sides at the hour of greatest need understood that probably it was a strategic mistake to have the level of dependency on an ally that both had. Of course, Armenia and EU had dependency on quite different allies, but nevertheless, methodologically, it was the same. There was this over-dependency on the ally, and in the hour of greatest need, it proved to be a strategic mistake for both. Now, out of this, there are consequences that should be taken. And here in Yerevan, I would say that the biggest question that is constantly raised is whether the European Union will show enough political will, political energy, and resources and effectiveness to solve the issue, to show enough of geopolitical sovereignty and ability to solve difficult geopolitical problems and to answer the threats that it is meeting. Out of those threats, of course, the biggest one is the threat coming from Russia and the conflict in Ukraine. And that is particularly important in this part of the world because, in my opinion, the war in Ukraine, it's not just about Ukraine. And first and foremost, it's about whole of the so-called post-Soviet space. Because Ukraine is not the first one. There was Georgia prior to Ukraine, and definitely is not going to be the last one. And generally speaking, in all of the so-called post-Soviet republics, there is a growing concern about their future relations with Russia and possible future Russian escalations, attacks, hybrid warfare, and the last one is actually happening in quite of the republics of the post-Soviet space. And in this trajectory, again, the most important thing whether the European Union will find enough of political will and energy within itself to be able to withstand this. But here, even if the European Union will find enough political will, energy, resources, I would like to repeat a point raised by Amanda, whether there is still time. Even if all of the resources, all of the political will, energy will be there, will be implemented to solve these issues, I think there is a great issue of time and the missed time since probably 2016 or even prior to that, probably since 2014, or even maybe prior to the 2008 when the first conflict in Georgia happened. Also, there is a question very often raised here in Yerevan whether the transatlantic community, or as we call it in this part of the world, the collective West, is still a reality. Can we describe it as a political reality, or whether it's more of a wishful thinking? And that's a big question for South Caucasus, because we are in the middle of this great regional powers, great worldwide powers with a competition in this region, and Russia, China, regional powers. They're not ashamed to use brute force. They are not to use economic force in this part of the world. There is this quite vivid example, in my opinion. Approximately at the same time, 3 South Caucasian republics signed strategic partnerships. Armenia signed a strategic partnership with the United States of America, while Azerbaijan and Georgia signed a strategic partnership with China. Now, since then, we have seen pretty decent, pretty impressive investments from the Chinese side to the other 2 republics, to Georgia and Azerbaijan. There is a growing commitment, there is a growing Chinese presence in these 2 republics. While Armenia, which basically betted on the United States and signed the strategic partnership with the United States, it's been more than, if I'm not mistaken, almost a half of a year have passed since the signature of the agreement, and not a single article from the agreement has been implemented so far. Well, there are very minor, very technical elements that could have been done. But even that wasn't done. And I think this is a very vivid example of what's going on in South Caucasus, where other centers of geopolitical power are significantly more active, significantly more successful in the implementation of political and economic and infrastructural projects compared to the West. And the probably last but not least element is that stability and predictability for this part of the world could be the most important thing. All of the South Caucasus taken together is significantly smaller than Ukraine. I'm not even talking about 3 different republics. And you know, minor changes in the geopolitical chessboard that won't be filled in Brussels or in Washington can have tectonic implementation in this part of the world. So the further the international relations deteriorate, the further the transatlantic ties are weakened, I would say that the very first heat and the very first pressure of that happening is on countries I just described, on those smaller powers like Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. So far, I would say that there is one growing common thing among these 3 republics. That is this, at least for 2 of the 3, it's a new concept in foreign policy, that is the foreign policy of diversification. In case of Armenia and in case of Georgia, this was basically a forced decision when both countries understood that continuation of their previous foreign policy is basically a dead end. And they introduced this new concept of the diversification of foreign policy. Azerbaijan was basically doing it for a decade at least, which creates some new reality where for the first time in the rememberable history, let's say, the 3 South Caucasian republics have more or less the same foreign policy agenda concept, which is, as I described, the diversification of foreign policy. That might create success, that might create chance of success, and the very first bird of these processes could be the last meeting in Tbilisi, where the 3 republics on the level of the deputy foreign ministers had a meeting. Now, if that format would continue, and if there is this growing conversation, growing ability to see and act in the same way to the rapid changes in the world, that might create the additional security belts or additional security pillows, let's say, for the region that it so much lacks in this ever-changing world.
Last word to Areg. France is one of the largest defense suppliers to Armenia. Do you see an opportunity in Europe's rearmament, however, with all the questions surrounding it, for Armenia to strengthen its own security?
Thank you. Prior to that, just one small postscriptum. I've heard the term multipolar world. To me, it doesn't feel multipolar, the world that is being created. It feels like unpolar world that is being created. It doesn't feel that there are a lot of polars. It rather feels that there is no polar around at all. With regards to what can be done on the strengthening, basically, the Armenia-EU relations, and I think that what France is doing should be the example. Because if we want to have stability and peace in South Caucasus, the number one element, the desired minimum for the stability and peace in the South Caucasus is the resilient Armenia. For as long as for Azerbaijan, and consequently to a level for Turkey, it's cheaper to force Armenia into doing something or to attack Armenia to get something, that's the way that they're going to behave. But as soon as Armenia would become resilient enough for it to make sense for Azerbaijan and for Turkey to negotiate with Armenia, we will very much see the negotiations happening. Thus, I would say that the further strengthening of cooperation in military technical, military educational, and further beyond between Armenia and the EU member states would just bring peace and stability to the region.